Friends analysis, starting with Joey, played by Matt LeBlanc. Though Joey appears to be one-dimensional and dim-witted, it is actually more that he is childlike. We see that Joey is not dim-witted. In fact, he has high social intelligence. We know this because he can charm girls into bed. We also see that he's very good at reading people and fitting in and using his charm and his abilities of acting and the skills that comes along with acting to fit in when he works with Monica, where he's hired just to be fired. And when he works in Chandler's office building, he fits in very well there as well, where he makes up this whole backstory about himself, or really the character that he's playing while he's there, in order to fit in. And everywhere he goes, people seem to really like Joey. As for picking up women, that might seem sleazy at first glance. In fact, we know that from Joey's love of food, such as pizza, sandwiches, cake, that all he is doing is obeying his body's impulses. Nothing wrong with that. The other thing that it might seem one-dimensional that he is just picking up women just to get them into bed. In fact, he does have a lot of affection within him that he ends up transferring onto Chandler in an ongoing bromance. We see him hugging Chandler a lot and staying up late talking to Chandler about his deepest thoughts and feelings. Joey's dream of being an actor and not being grounded in reality is slightly telling of his childlike outlook and character. Even the fact that Joey had the man bag that Rachel gave him tells us that he isn't really fixed into gender stereotypes, much like kids. He just is. He's just doing what feels right to him. Next character, Rachel, played by Jennifer Aniston. Rachel, though appearing as being somewhat ditzy, actually has a very big heart and always follows her heart. We see this from the very get-go. She leaves her fiance Barry at the altar on her wedding day. She just knew that this wasn't right for her and followed her heart and thus left, even if it went out to the abyss of the real world. She even knew that her heart wasn't to do what her parents wanted her to do. Her dad was a very tough force to deal with, and same with her mom. They both were very old-fashioned, and her mom was basically what Rachel didn't want to be, which was having a sham life and having a sham marriage, where on the outside things appear very well, but on the inside not following one's heart. Rachel had the only reason Rachel appeared as being ditzy is because she never actually had to do these things before, such as get a job, go to interviews. We see that she struggles doing a job like the coffee house. We see that in interviews, the guy tells her that, she has ink on her lip and she mistakes it that he wants a kiss. Rachel, again, follows her heart, which is her passion for fashion. And this is greatly overlooked, that she went from a very dependent person using her daddy's credit cards to being a strong, independent woman who went out into the world to not only find her own way, but just find her own. We see that Rachel not only stood up to her mom, her dad, her ex-fiance, she even gets a reassurance that she is on the right path when her sisters show up and basically have the traits that Rachel could have had if she had stayed in her sham type life where she's dependent on her husband and her dad. She sees her sister Jill and her other sister, whose name I can't remember, and they're ill equipped to deal with the world around them and are selfish and immature as a result. And in contrast, we see how far along Rachel has come and just how strong she is because she ventured out on her own. And though initially seeming like she didn't have brains, showed number one, that she has a huge heart, but also is more than capable of doing the things once she sets her mind to them. It wasn't that she doesn't have brains, but just that she had never been taught how to do these things. But we see that she indeed does have brains. The next character, Phoebe, played by Lisa Kudrow. Phoebe tells us that no matter how dark your past is, that you can still have a bright present and future. She is very much an artistic, free-spirited hippie. Phoebe, though always seeming like she has her head in the clouds or being up in the air, even with mad ideas like wanting to fly an airplane despite not having any training to fly, once you look at her, you always become grounded because people might complain that, their ex-girlfriend was a lesbian or that, they're not happy in their job when you see the harsh reality that someone has had in their life, such as their dad abandoning them, their mom killing themselves, and having to resort to crime when living on the street just to get by. We see the perspective that maybe things aren't that bad after all. Maybe my problems aren't so bad after all. So in spite that she is very much up in the clouds, she does bring everyone back down to the ground. Phoebe, we know, is not a bad person. That the crime that she did in the past, she only did to survive. We know this because at one point she was living in a box and getting chased around the coal yard by a, raving schizophrenic. That she wouldn't actually choose that life. She only had to go through that life. Phoebe very much goes with the wind. She feels like cycling a bike, she cycles a bike. She feels like going on rollerblades or running through the park in a mad way. That's what she does. And she never cares about what other people think of her, unlike the others. Though Phoebe has wacky beliefs, like such as her, granny being inside of a cat at one point or reading tarot cards. She has very much strong, grounded political ideologies. We know that she talks about a revolution coming, which again may seem very much up in the air, but if you and up in the clouds, it is very much grounded in reality that Phoebe is aware that the government is not so good. I have yet to analyze why in the alternate reality episode of Friends, where Ross was still going out with his lesbian ex-wife and Phoebe was a stockbroker, why in fact Phoebe was a stockbroker in this episode. I'm sure there's something there. There was a joke in it where she said, where they're talking about sexual fantasies, and she said, or like, yeah, you could imagine that, you're in the middle of the stock room floor, doing it, and everyone's watching and cheering. And she's like, well, that totally never happened, right? That is a very raunchy joke for Friends, but I've yet to analyze why they chose her to be a stockbroker there. Phoebe is not very good at things, but she still does them anyway. For example, being a guitar playing and singer, songwriter. Her songs aren't great. Her singing is not great, but she still does it anyway. Ross is David Schwimmer, and he is an academic. He knows everything about what happened thousands of years ago, things in space, things with dinosaurs, but he can't figure out the present. Ross is a very poor judge of character. He picked a woman to go out with who clearly was a lesbian. He also ended up with Janice for a while. And he also tried talking about gas when trying to flirt with a girl delivering pizza. He even was such a poor judge of character that even as a college professor chose a student to have a romantic relationship with. Ross, similar to Monica, has actually quite a decent background, and to whom much is given, much is expected. Hence why Ross is an achiever type. Not only is he a bookworm, but he is trying to constantly make up for his lack of social skills with people. Similar to how Ross can conquer the old knowledge, he could also do this in the alternate reality where he does the karate, where he can conquer some ancient form of combat, but he still is a hopeless romantic. Ross is the only character to have a kid. Ross, though very logical and very rational, has poor emotional intelligence. He, went off with another woman when him and Rachel were on a break, and yet he's a very jealous type of character when Rachel simply has a work colleague called Mark. We also see that Ross is a bit of a wimp in many ways. He can't deal with the men that Emily's friends are when they're playing rugby, and he even can barely take on, Phoebe and Rachel. He has to try scare them. When him and Chandler were at the coffee house, he was easily bullied by these two guys who wanted their seats on the couch. In a nutshell, Ross is all brains and not really much balls. He even was so afraid of Phoebe when he thought Phoebe was a boy. Phoebe mugged him when he was a kid and before they knew each other. That's how little balls Ross has. Next character, Monica Geller, played by Courtney Cox, now Courtney Arquette. Monica Geller, tries to control everything. The only thing she can't control is her mom's approval. She can control every last item in her house, and she can control even down to the slightest pinch of salt in her chef and catering job, but she still can't get her mom's approval. Monica, who ended up going out with the most fun character, which is Chandler, is actually the least fun. She is dry. She made a fun game like throwing and catching a ball into a boring competitive sport. Monica, though very dry, is very mature. When she lived with Rachel, she was very much the sort of mother of the two. She was the more responsible. And even in her relationship with Chandler, she's also the more learned one. Monica has to control her diet quite a lot, and that is because initially she started off very overweight. Ironically, her job she went into was food. This is a constant reminder that she is very much in control of her own actions, that she can be constantly surrounded by food and yet not eat it. She's a very, very disciplined character. Monica feels underappreciated. Her dad prefers Ross, and her mom also prefers Ross. This might be another reason why Monica is so competitive, because she's always had to compete against Ross for her parents' attention. Next character, Chandler. The toughest for me to actually get my head around. Chandler seems to be a sad clown. His coping mechanism for his unusual past is humor. Both his mom and dad were interested in other men and not interested in Chandler as a kid. Chandler was an only child, therefore was always left on his own while his parents were off gallivanting with other men. This meant that Chandler was a keen observer of things, hence why he has such good observational humor. The major resolve that we can have with Chandler that everyone's happy about is that, in spite of the fact that he has spent his childhood and adult life being miserable, he does end up having kids with Monica and getting to be the type of father to his kids that he never got growing up. Also, he ended up going into an advertising job where he can finally be creative. Just as Monica also has kids and can finally be the mother that she wanted to be, that she never got from her own mother. Chandler is not good with romance because his parents were also not very good with romantic relationships.